What's going on, guys? This is my first interview where I'm sitting in this chair, purely because Bret's a boss and he's massive. No, we're here with Bret Contreras, and he just finished up his interview on glute training, and he absolutely blew it out of the park and gave the audience well more than what they paid for. So it was a really interesting and well thought out presentation, and I wanted to talk to you today about some of the little tidbits on your presentation, but I guess first you want to just introduce what the topic was that you discussed today.
Yep, I just did a topic on glute training,
Nice.
the art and science of glute training. Yep, surprise.
Yeah, and you obviously covered the nuts and bolts of glute training, but something I wanted to ask you was related to EMG, and you know how that has its problems, but many people say, oh well, EMG is just activation, and that doesn't necessarily mean muscle growth and things like that. So do you want to talk about that and why EMG is important and why potentially it may be a problem as well?
Okay, so this is a great question. So earlier in my career, I just kind of assumed EMG activity is very closely mimics muscle, like tension on the muscle force. And so I just thought any exercise, the higher the EMG, the better its ability to grow muscle. And then, like everything, the field grows, you learn more. And actually, my intern, Andrew Vygotsky, he started publishing, genius. He's my former intern, and he's now so smart, and he's getting his PhD in biomedical engineering. He wrote a couple of letters to the editors and then a review paper with a few high-level EMG researchers on EMG and what you can and can't conclude. One of the things you hear a lot of researchers say is because EMG was higher during this activity, then motor unit recruitment was higher, or this will lead to greater hypertrophy. And you can't infer those two things. You can't infer greater motor unit recruitment or greater hypertrophy. Now, so then there's kind of the pendulum swung this way, and then it swung back to people. You see this on social media a lot. Oh, EMG is worthless, and that's not true. So if you look at this DeLuca study from many years ago, he actually plotted EMG activity versus muscle force, like in an isokinetic dynamometer, and they showed that it was very linearly related. It wasn't like perfectly linear, but it was a lot better than. What else do you rely on?
Yeah.
We can't measure muscle force very easily in sports science, and the easiest way is to use EMG. So, but then a new paper came out like a year ago showing that this was fascinating because I'd wondered this for a long time, and it was just a year ago that this study emerged showing they had equal electrical input at different muscle lengths and postures, and it showed different EMG output. And so you can have the changes in postures and shape can influence the things like how much calcium and the sarcolemma and the membrane and things like that. So it can influence the action potentials and things like that. So that throws a cog in the works. Now, what I will say from a practical standpoint, I've utilized this with much success, but this won't be useful for most of the listeners. Because there's no company right now that I can say, hey Jacob, I'm going to come to your place and you're going to do a comprehensive EMG panel on me and put electrodes on every subdivision of every muscle and have me do 100 different exercises. And even then, so I do think you can utilize EMG well when you say, I'm going to do this similar exercise, range of motion is going to be similar. And then relative loading is, say, I'm going to have you do 6 reps of a 10 rep max or something like that, and it's through a similar arc of motion. Then I think you can compare the two and say this is probably better at building muscle than this, especially if you got big differences, like this exercise only activated 30% of MVIC, and this exercise activated 70%. But if it's 10 percentage points, it might not be that big of a deal. But if you use different loads to failure, then you'll always get higher mean and peak EMG with the heavier loads. But with the lighter loads, you can get the same hypertrophy. And this has been shown in training studies. The general consensus, there's about 23 studies now showing similar hypertrophy between heavy loads and light loads if they're carried out to failure. And the reason why is even though EMG output is higher with the heavier loads, the set is longer duration with the lighter loads.
Yeah.
And so this is according to Henneman's size principle. You start out activating the lower threshold motor units, and then by the end of the set, as fatigue builds up, you're utilizing the higher threshold motor units and activating and recruiting them. And then you end up getting full recruitment of all the motor units, and you get a similar hypertrophy stimulus.
Yeah.
So, in summary, I never finished off this part. I use them with clients, and I measure, and people are very different.
Yeah.
So I remember one client, she got sky-high glute activation from doing abduction exercises. Like, we're talking like 80% MVIC. So I said, you need to do these every day. Do these like 5 days a week. And she did. And you should see her before and after picture. It's phenomenal. I've had another client who gets barely any activation from abduction exercises, and she's doing the exercises correctly.
Yep.
So I don't know if she's recruiting more TFL or hip external rotator. It's just her anatomy. So I said, don't do these. But even with, I had one subject do front squats, parallel back squats, full back squats, goblet squats, and she gets way higher glute activation with front squats than with the other exercise. I had another client do hip thrust variations. She gets way higher peak activation with band hip thrust than she does barbell. So I stick them with that variation, and they see great results. So I think it can be very useful in that context, but it's just rare. You can't go get unless you have a friend, a trainer, coach who owns an EMG unit, which I don't know of any except for myself, then you can't get that done. But I've found that per individual, if you focus on the exercise, like if I'm trying to build the upper pecs, you're not going to build them if you're not being active, if that region isn't being activated. And you measure that through EMG, but it's not linearly related to muscle force, motor unit recruitment, hypertrophy. Obviously, it is related, though. You can't grow a muscle without activating it much.
And I think in anecdote, we've seen that. It's just we haven't got the science there that accurately represents that. And
exactly. We don't know the threshold, too. Like,
yes.
What's a meaningful difference? Do you need what percentage of MVIC? How much more is it meaningful? I don't know if we're going to have those answers in a long time.
Yeah, definitely. And something you started touching on there was obviously tension being a very important component of muscle hypertrophy. We've got the magnitude of tension, which is the absolute load, as well as the duration of tension, so the time under tension. And obviously different exercises are self-selecting towards different progressions in tension. So, we would use, say, for example, a squat. It's probably going to lend itself better to load progression over time than rep progression. We wouldn't want to go to 20 plus reps. Whereas there are going to be some movements, where we're performing higher reps because they're self-selecting towards certain rep ranges and loading zones. So some interesting stuff you have done in the glute lab related to our application of intensity, which is tension, is applying very high volume training to the glutes. So we know that volume and intensity are inextricably related, and if we look to the research, we see that 10 to 20 sets is the common figure thrown around for volume for hypertrophy. However, because the glutes are trained with both high magnitudes and high durations of tension in like banded work and things like this, which have a very different type of fatigue, you train your clients with volumes that exceed those numbers quite significantly, and you've got pretty good results time and time again. Do you want to talk about that? And then I guess that ties into the study that everybody's talking about that can't be spoken about, that could be supporting what you're doing in the glute lab.
Okay, so good question. So yes, with my clients, we tend to do 30 to 40 sets per week of glutes. And you're right, most experts will recommend like 10 to 15 sets per week. And the reason why we get away with more exercises, more sets, more volume is because I follow the rule of thirds.
Yeah.
And there's 3 components to it. Roughly 1/3 of the glute exercise we perform are axial loading, 1/3 are horizontal or anterior-posterior loading, and 1/3 are lateral or rotary. So axial loading is like a squat where the load's coming from above. Those tend to create the most muscle damage. They involve the most range of motion. They involve the greatest eccentric phases. They're the hardest to recover from. And posterior loading is like a hip thrust or a back extension where you're, pushing the weight forward. And these exercises don't create as much muscle damage. They don't have as much eccentric loading. They don't have as much of a range of motion. And the peak tension is at end-range hip extension where the glutes are at a shorter muscle length. So they don't create as much damage. You can do more of them. Finally, there's the lateral and rotary loading. Think a lot of lateral band work. Think of these band exercises. You start mostly in anatomical position, and then you move to the shortened position. So you're not even loading the stretch position. So you can do a lot more of these, a lot more volume, and it still recover. The second component relates to load. Roughly a third of our sets are heavy, a third are moderate, a third are light. And with
that
light,
ties in with the exercises that you select as well.
the exercise and the effort. So the third component is effort. Roughly a third of our exercises are done to failure, a third close to failure, and a third nowhere close to failure. And a lot of this stuff is just throwing an extra volume that can build muscle but doesn't contribute to the overall fatigue or recovery. So yes, if you were to only do parking lot barbell walking lunges to failure, 10 sets a week would be really tough. Those get you really sore. Would that be the best way to build the glutes? No, it would not. The lunges work the lower glutes better than the upper glutes. They don't get super high activation. It's good eccentric component, good time under tension, but and a lot of muscle damage, almost too much muscle damage if you're doing lots of sets of those.
Which limits the amount of volume.
Limits the amount of volume you can perform. And it wouldn't be the best way to grow the glutes, but ironically, your clients would think you're an amazing trainer because they equate soreness to muscle growth, and they're not correlated. It's a very big misconception in the field, and I always tell my clients, if they're like, oh my god, my glutes were so sore, it took me 3 days to be able to walk, you're such a good trainer. And I'm like,
oh fuck,
I didn't mean to get you that sore. That's bad.
I'm sorry.
I try to explain to them, I don't want you getting sore like that all the time.
Awesome. Guys, make sure you check out Bret Contreras. Follow the Glute Lab. Just opened up in San Diego. I'm not sure how many of our followers are from San Diego, but if you're in the area, make sure you check it out. Thank you for coming down, man, and I really appreciate everything you do.
Thank you, Jacob.